Voting against the board to withhold no proxies. Feeling their profits ripped up in Wall Street greed.
And welcome back, all you bulls and bears and betas out there, to the buzz of this Proxyopoly spin-off series we call the Proxyopoly Podcast. I'm your host, the Proxyopolist, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades. Here again with another exclusive proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report for none other than Goldman Sachs. That's right, Proxyopolists. Following the Proxyopoly score for Deutsche Bank, BlackRock, Tesla, Walmart, ExxonMobil, Meta Platforms, Amazon, Spotify, Alphabet, Microsoft, Apple, we now have on the docket today a scathing corporate governance analysis of Goldman Sachs by Proxyopoly TM, spanning 50 some odd pages in length. So sit back, Proxyopolists, and relax. It's going to be about 2 hours of this, so I hope we're all ready. The Proxyopoly score for Goldman Sachs. Introduction. Goldman Sachs is a global financial powerhouse, synonymous with Wall Street's highest echelons. Founded in 1869, it has evolved from a humble partnership into a diversified banking, securities, and investment management firm with operations spanning the globe. Goldman's role in global finance is pivotal. It advises corporations and governments on mergers and capital raises, trades across virtually every market, and stewards trillions in client assets. Its brand and scale make it, quote, one of the most influential institutions in global markets, unquote, as one recent profile noted. Yet this influence has come with a reputation for aggressive profit-seeking and insularity, earning Goldman colorful monikers like the, quote, vampire squid, unquote, in popular discourse. Behind the dry financials lies a firm, often at the center of market movements and controversies. In an operational and governance overview, Goldman Sachs operates under a strict regulatory regime as a bank holding company, but it retains a culture of risk-taking honed during its partnership era. The company is widely held by institutional investors, about 74% of shares, and no single shareholder commands more than 10%. The largest owners are passive fund giants, such as Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock, collectively owning over 20% of Goldman Sachs. Insiders, including top executives, hold only a tiny fraction, approximately 0.5%. This dispersed ownership means formal governance power rests in the board of directors and management rather than any controlling shareholder. Goldman's board of directors currently has 14 members, 13 independents, plus CEO David Solomon, and recently added President John Waldron. The board oversees management and is charged with upholding robust governance practices, at least in theory. In 2015, after pressure from investors, Goldman adopted Proxy Access, allowing major shareholders to nominate board candidates. Shareholders owning 3% for 3 years can now nominate up to 20% of the board. The firm also moved to annual elections for all directors, with no staggered terms, aligning with best practices for board accountability. These measures were meant to improve shareholder influence. However, as we will explore in this podcast episode, structural openness doesn't always translate to practical influence over a firm as formidable as Goldman Sachs. Internally, Goldman's governance has historically blurred lines between management and board leadership. David Solomon serves as both CEO and chairman, concentrating power at the top. The board's independent directors do appoint a lead director, but the dual role of Solomon remains a governance flashpoint. In 2023, a shareholder proposal to require an independent chair separating Solomon's roles garnered approximately 16% support. A minority, but enough to keep the issue alive. This dynamic, a powerful executive suite buffered by a hand-picked board, underpins many of Goldman's governance challenges. Segueing into public controversies, Goldman Sachs' history is replete with high-profile controversies, often reflecting tensions between its pursuit of profit and broader societal impacts. During the 2008 financial crisis, Goldman was criticized for selling mortgage securities it had privately deemed troublesome and was later tagged in a Senate report as a case of Wall Street greed. The firm settled fraud charges related to one such product, the infamous Abacus CDO, in 2010. Perhaps the most costly scandal was its role in Malaysia's 1MDB sovereign fund fiasco. Between 2009 and 2014, Goldman bankers helped raise $6.5 billion for 1MDB and, as U.S. prosecutors later detailed, quote, paid more than $1.6 billion in bribes to foreign officials, unquote, to win the business. Proceeds of the bond issues were looted by conspirators, while Goldman earned a hefty $600 million fee. While the dust settled, Goldman in 2020 admitted wrongdoing under U.S. bribery law and paid a $2.9 billion settlement, the largest penalty ever under FCPA. It was a humbling episode that led Goldman to claw back $174 million in pay from executives, including then CEO Lloyd Blankfein and others. Current CEO David Solomon noted the firm, quote, did not adequately address red flags, unquote, in that debacle, while Solomon positioned the settlement as a chance to move forward. The 1MDB saga underscored serious lapses in Goldman's compliance culture and board oversight. Goldman's aggressive culture has also resulted in internal discrimination disputes. In 2023, the firm agreed to pay $215 million to settle a long-running class action lawsuit alleging systemic gender bias. The case, first filed in 2010, accused Goldman of, quote, systemically underpaying and undervaluing women, unquote, with female professionals receiving lower pay and weaker performance reviews than male peers. Roughly 2,800 women were covered by the settlement. As part of the resolution, Goldman pledged to hire an independent expert to review its promotion and evaluation processes and to conduct pay equity studies. The firm officially denied wrongdoing even as it wrote the sizable check, a pattern not uncommon on Wall Street. This settlement, one of the largest ever in gender bias case, highlights a governance concern. How effectively is Goldman's board holding management accountable for workplace equity and culture? The fact that it took over a decade of litigation to reach this point suggests room for improvement in internal oversight and responsiveness. More recently, Goldman has found itself navigating controversies at the intersection of politics and environmental social governance, or ESG, commitments. In late 2024, Goldman withdrew from the Net Zero Banking Alliance, or NZBA, a global coalition of banks working to align lending with climate goals. It was the biggest bank to leave that alliance, and Goldman's departure came amid pressure from U.S. Republican officials who argued such climate collaborations might violate antitrust rules. Goldman's statement emphasized a focus on, quote, elevated regulatory requirements, unquote, and its own sustainability efforts. Nonetheless, leaving the NZBA sparked criticism that Goldman was backpedaling on climate action. The firm insisted it would still report progress on its $750 billion sustainable finance goal set in 2019, and noted that it had already achieved 75% of that target by 2023. CEO David Solomon has articulated a, quote, both/and, unquote, approach. Continue to finance traditional energy clients while investing in decarbonization. Quote, it's not an or, it's an and, unquote, he wrote in the 2023 Sustainability Report. This pragmatic stance has pleased neither extreme. Goldman faces ongoing activist pressure to restrict fossil fuel financing while simultaneously defending itself from anti-ESG political attacks. The board's challenge is to steer a consistent policy that protects long-term shareholder value amidst these crosswinds. Goldman's ESG performance ratings from external observers are mixed. For instance, MSCI gives Goldman an A, average, and Sustainalytics scores at around 30, with moderate risk, in recent reports. Respectable, but not leadership territory. There's a sense that Goldman's commitment to climate and social issues, while loudly proclaimed, can waver when profits or politics intervene. Indeed, Goldman has shown a willingness to quietly adjust its public commitments. In early 2025, following a change in the U.S. administration, Goldman erased previous diversity targets from its regulatory filings. This move came after an executive order by President Donald Trump aimed at curtailing DEI programs among federal contractors. Goldman had set ambitious goals for a more diversified workforce by 2025, but under the new political climate, it, quote, made certain adjustments to reflect developments in the law, unquote. CEO David Solomon diplomatically affirmed the firm's belief in diversity while conforming to the pressure to remove specific targets. This incident is telling. It demonstrates Goldman's adeptness at regulatory evasion or avoidance, a theme we will quantify in this report later. The firm towed the legal line, arguably at the cost of transparency, about its progress on inclusion. This came on the heels of shareholders roundly rejecting anti-diversity proposals at the 2023 annual meeting. 98% of shareholders voted against two proposals that would have dismantled Goldman's DEI initiatives. In other words, investors signaled strong support for the firm's diversity efforts. Yet Goldman still pulled back its formal diversity goals in response to political risk. Such governance nuances illustrate the Proxyopoly TM tension highlighted in this report. To whom does the board truly answer when social responsibility and legal expedience collide? Meanwhile, Goldman is racing to innovate in the realm of artificial intelligence, or AI, an area that presents both opportunity and governance quandaries. In 2024, Goldman launched a 3-year program to, quote, increase automation and ultimately productivity, including through the use of artificial intelligence, unquote. By early 2025, the firm disclosed that many employees have access to generative AI tools, a developer copilot for coding, an in-house natural language assistant, or GSAI, and other AI use cases across its banking and markets divisions. Essentially, Goldman is infusing AI into everything from software development to customer interactions and risk management. This push is born of competitive necessity. Goldman's analysts have even estimated that generative AI could eventually automate a substantial portion of work in finance. Their oft-cited study said approximately 44% of legal tasks and similarly high percentages in finance could be done by AI. But it comes with governance responsibilities. The board must oversee how AI impacts Goldman's workforce, clients, and risk profile. There's irony in Goldman embracing AI while its regulators warn about AI-related risks. The SEC's enforcement director noted that disclosure failures around AI, quote, as a security threat, unquote, could invite individual liability. Goldman's own research shows that AI boosting efficiency, for example, loan approvals cut from 14 days to 24 hours, with a 230% increase in customer conversion on its markets platform thanks to AI algorithms, and reducing compliance costs by 28%. Yet, challenges like algorithmic bias and cyber vulnerabilities are real. An internal review found that 32% of Goldman's AI models had bias issues in feature engineering, which the firm has tried to mitigate with adversarial debiasing techniques. The board's governance of AI development is still nascent. Shareholders will want to see that Goldman's much-touted AI revolution doesn't run ahead of its risk controls or ethical guardrails. In summary, Goldman Sachs stands as an exemplar of the modern corporation wrestling with legacy and change. Its governance framework has gradually opened to shareholders via proxy access and annual elections, but real control remains concentrated. Public controversies, from billion-dollar corruption fines to landmark discrimination settlements, have periodically shaken the firm, yet arguably not shattered its insular culture. As we turn to the Proxyopoly TM ratings, we will quantify just how entrenched Goldman's governance is and the implications for stakeholders. The 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings which underlie the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score will shine a light on Goldman's resistance to outside influence. The fortification in its bylaws, its attitude toward shareholder rights, the staying power of its executives, and its knack for ducking rules. Each Proxyopoly TM rating is scored analogous to a beta coefficient, capturing the volatility impact of a single proxy vote on public welfare and free markets. A higher score with a positive beta suggests that votes at this company carry outsized influence on or pose greater risk to general market health due to governance distortions. A lower score with negative beta might imply a stabilizing or countervailing influence. These Proxyopoly TM ratings are presented to 2 decimal places for precision. Finally, we will compute Goldman's final Proxyopoly TM score as a weighted average of the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings and benchmark it against peers previously mentioned in this podcast series like Spotify, Amazon, BlackRock, ExxonMobil, Microsoft, and Alphabet. Along the way, we maintain a dry tone of irony. For there is no shortage of irony in a bank that champions innovation and meritocracy publicly while clinging to old habits and practice. Segueing into the second section of this episode, the Proxyopoly TM ratings. We begin with Proxyopoly TM rating number 1. Proxy Accumulation Resistance, or PAR. By definition, proxy accumulation resistance measures how difficult it is for outside shareholders to accumulate significant voting power or influence through proxy voting. In other words, it gauges the structural and practical barriers that prevent an insurgent shareholder or coalition from amassing enough proxies to challenge management's control. In Proxyopoly TM analysis, Goldman Sachs presents an interesting case of diffuse ownership with latent barriers to proxy accumulation. On paper, Goldman has a 1-share, 1-vote capital structure and no controlling shareholders, seemingly presenting low resistance in this category. The firm has no dual-class stock with unequal voting rights, unlike, say, Alphabet or Meta. Each share of Goldman Sachs common stock carries equal voting weight, and with approximately 350 million shares outstanding, the voting power is widely distributed among institutional investors. The 3 top holders are Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock, together owning approximately 21% of shares outstanding. No single investor holds more than 10%. Vanguard holds 9.5%, being the largest shareholder. Furthermore, Goldman's adoption of proxy access in 2015 ostensibly empowers shareholders. Any group owning 3% for 3 years can nominate up to 2 directors on the company's proxy. These features suggest a shareholder-friendly regime with minimal formal obstacles to accumulating influence via proxies. However, the reality of exercising that influence is more complex. First, the very dispersion of Goldman's shareholder base creates a coordination challenge, with ownership, quote, heavily concentrated among major index funds and institutional investors. Effective proxy campaigns require persuading these large but often passive holders. Index funds typically vote with management except on the most egregious issues. In Goldman's case, the big 3 institutions, Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock, have historically sided with management on key votes. For example, all major asset managers voted against the 2023 independent chair proposal, contributing to its defeat. This passive stance increases resistance to any outsider trying to rock the boat. In effect, while no explicit control group exists, an informal, quote, management block, unquote, emerges from the inertia of index investors and the firm's own insiders. It's telling that corporate insiders, despite owning under 0.5% of shares, face little trouble securing re-election and support for their proposals year after year. The proxy plumbing The mechanics of getting enough votes works in management's favor due to apathy and alignment of these giants. Second, Goldman's bylaws and governance policies, though modern, still include provisions that raise the threshold for meaningful action. For instance, calling a special shareholder meeting at Goldman requires a fairly high ownership threshold, commonly 25% at many companies. Goldman's precise threshold isn't publicly cited, but it's likely in that range if allowed at all. This means an activist cannot easily force off-cycle issues onto the agenda without broad support. Additionally, while proxy access exists, it limits any shareholder group to 20% of board seats. For a board of 14, that means at most 2 nominees from the shareholders, regardless of how many votes they control. A built-in cap on an insurgent's influence in board composition. Another subtle form of resistance is regulatory. As a systemically important financial institution, Goldman is under Federal Reserve oversight and subject to regulations, like the Bank Holding Company Act. That could complicate a hostile takeover or rapid accumulation of shares by, say, a private equity buyer. The Fed would scrutinize any acquisition of 10% or more. While this doesn't directly affect proxy voting, an investor can vote shares without regulatory nod, it deters activists from building very large stakes in banks compared to other industries. In free markets, an underperforming company might face a takeover, but Goldman's size, with over $100 billion in market cap, and regulation make it essentially unbuyable. Activist hedge funds also tend to avoid banking giants due to regulatory complexity. This insulates Goldman from, quote, the market for corporate control, unquote, an external check on management, which indirectly raises the resistance to proxy influence. The board and management are keenly aware that no Carl Icahn figure is likely to accumulate over 5% of votable shares outstanding and launch a proxy war on Goldman Sachs. The most notable activist campaign involving Goldman in recent years was actually an internal revolt. Several high-ranking partners reportedly voiced concerns in 2022 and 2023 about Solomon's leadership and strategy, particularly the costly misadventure in consumer banking. But, unlike a shareholder activist, the partners had no direct vote. It was behind closed doors pressure. The outcome? David Solomon remained firmly in place as CEO, and the board backed him, illustrating the resistance of management against even insider dissent. Empirical evidence of proxy accumulation resistance can be gleaned from voting results. Shareholder proposals not endorsed by management at Goldman nearly always fail by wide margins. In 2023, none of the 5 shareholder proposals on topics ranging from lobbying disclosures to fossil fuel phase-outs came close to passing. Most received 7 to 16% support from votable shares outstanding. The proposal for an independent chair got approximately 16% support from votable shares outstanding, 39.9 million for versus 203.9 million against. A climate policy proposal got approximately 12% support from votable shares outstanding. These low numbers reflect not just contentment with management, but the difficulty of rallying disparate shareholders. Even proposals aligned with broader investor interests, such as lobbying transparency, failed as large institutions demurred. By contrast, at some other companies, shareholder proposals on environmental or governance issues often earn 30 to 40% support. Goldman's low scores signal a higher proxy accumulation resistance. management facing little risk of investors accumulating enough votes to force changes. Overall, Goldman's proxy accumulation resistance reflects a moderately high resistance. There are no smoking gun defenses like dual-class stock or a poison pill, so it's not at the extreme. But the combination of widely diffused ownership, heavy index fund influence, high hurdles for special actions, and regulatory shelter from takeovers means an outside shareholder's volatility impact via proxy is dampened. A single proxy vote or even a whole slate from an activist has a limited chance of altering Goldman's trajectory absent an extraordinary coalition. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM assigns Goldman Sachs a proxy accumulation resistance of positive 0.65. This positive value, above zero, indicates Goldman's structure tends to absorb or neutralize the impact of proxy votes on public welfare in free markets. In Proxyopoly TM terms, a vote at Goldman is less likely to spur change than at an average company. The positive 0.65 reflects that while not bulletproof, Goldman is substantially insulated from shareholder upheaval. For context, Alphabet's proxy accumulation resistance was positive 1.9 in this podcast's prior analysis due to its dual-class lockdown by insiders. Goldman's proxy accumulation resistance of positive 0.65 suggests the inertia of diffuse ownership can be almost as potent as outright voting lock. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 2, the Bylaw Fortification Index, or BFI. By definition, Bylaw Fortification Index assesses how strongly a company's charter and bylaws are fortified to entrench management or board power. High fortification means rules that make it hard to change governance, for example, supermajority vote requirements, classified board, limit shareholder rights, etc. A lower BFI means a more open, flexible governance structure. Essentially, Bylaw Fortification Index is about the legal armor plating that management has welded onto the corporate vessel. In Proxyopoly TM analysis, on the surface, Goldman's bylaws look fairly standard for a modern large-cap firm, which is to say moderately fortified but not excessively so. Let's inventory the key governance provisions. Board structure. Goldman's board is unclassified and has annual elections. This is a shareholder-friendly trait. All directors stand for election each year, allowing investors to potentially replace the entire board in one annual meeting, if they so choose. Many companies ditched classified or staggered boards in the 2000s. Goldman followed suit. So, no fortification there. Kudos to Goldman Sachs on this point. Moving on to majority voting. Goldman employs majority voting for director elections with resignation policies for any director who fails to get a majority. This again is good practice and not an entrenchment mechanism. It means a director who doesn't get over 50% of votes must offer to resign. Thus, board members cannot cling on with plurality support. In 2023, all Goldman directors easily cleared the majority threshold, unsurprisingly, but the mechanism is at least in place. Moving on to proxy access for the Bylaw Fortification Index. As noted, Goldman added proxy access in 2015. This provision reduces fortification by giving long-term shareholders a route to nominate board candidates without running a full proxy contest. It was a shareholder-driven reform, and Goldman's board, under pressure, adopted it proactively, signaling some willingness to yield ground. The restrictions of 3% ownership, 3-year holding period, max 2 seats, or 20% of the board are typical and were likely a negotiated outcome to prevent abuse. Proxy access is a hole in the castle wall that activists could, in theory, exploit. Though to date, no shareholders have attempted to use it at Goldman Sachs, perhaps because assembling 3% of Goldman shares is approximately $7 billion worth of stock. In itself is non-trivial. Moving on to shareholder rights within the context of Bylaw Fortification Index. Does Goldman allow shareholders to call special meetings or act by written consent? These are 2 key governance rights. Goldman's bylaws do not permit shareholders to call a special meeting, but only with a supermajority of shares, as is common. The exact threshold isn't in public domain, but many companies set it at 25% or more, effectively meaning only a coalition of large investors could do it. As for written consent, or the ability for shareholders to take action without a meeting, if enough sign consent, Goldman disallows that, again, typical for big firms. Eliminating written consent is a proactive measure to ensure all actions happen in a controlled meeting environment. The upshot: spontaneous shareholder action is curtailed. Supermajority requirements at Goldman within the context of the Bylaw Fortification Index. Historically, companies had supermajority vote requirements, 66% or even 80%, to approve certain charter amendments or mergers, which entrench management by making it hard for shareholders to change rules or accept unsolicited offers. Goldman's current charter and corporate governance guidelines, as updated through 2025, do not appear to contain onerous supermajority provisions. Most decisions require a simple majority. For instance, bylaw amendments can typically be done by a majority vote of shares, or by the board itself. Notably, Goldman's board can amend bylaws unilaterally, as it did to implement proxy access. This is a double-edged sword. It allows quick adoption of shareholder-friendly policies, but also means the board could unilaterally enact anti-takeover measures like a poison pill without a shareholder vote. So far, Goldman has not put a permanent poison pill in place. There is no evidence of a standing shareholder rights plan, or poison pill, which is a point in favor of lower fortification. Executive and director removal in the context of the Bylaw Fortification Index. Can shareholders remove directors without cause? In Delaware, where Goldman is incorporated, shareholders can remove directors with or without cause if the board is de-staggered, which Goldman's is, unless the charter says otherwise. Goldman's charter does not appear to impose extra barriers here, so yes, a simple majority could vote out directors at a meeting. However, practically, because of the proxy system's aforementioned issues, this theoretical power is rarely exercised. Other fortifications in the context of the Bylaw Fortification Index include one subtle fortification, being leadership structure, combining the CEO and chairman roles, which Goldman does, can be seen as a governance fortification around the CEO. It's not a bylaw per se, but it's a structural choice. Shareholders have signaled they'd prefer an independent chair via proposals, albeit low support, but the board has maintained the status quo. Having an independent lead director is the compromise. But that role's power is limited compared to an independent chair. So in practice, David Solomon as chair and CEO fortifies management's control over meeting agendas and board discussions. Given this mix, Goldman's bylaws are less of a brick wall and more of a high fence. The company isn't immune to takeover or proxy fights because of any quirky legal provisions. Rather, it's immune mostly due to scale and investor inertia. In fact, compared to many technology companies with dual-class shares or family-controlled firms, Goldman's formal governance looks almost democratic. However, one must consider the firm's history and soft fortifications. Goldman's culture of tight-knit partnership and alumni network often result in a board stacked with friendly faces. For example, the board includes David Viniar, Goldman's former CFO of 12 years, who joined the board soon after retiring from management. Having longtime insider on the board can fortify management influence informally. Similarly, John Waldron, president and COO, was just added to the board in 2025, further consolidating executive influence on the board. While these aren't bylaw issues, they reflect a governance philosophy that isn't exactly arm's length. It's easier to hold management accountable when the board is fully independent. Goldman's board has insiders and ex-insiders who may be less inclined to challenge the status quo. One relevant bylaw change in recent memory was Goldman's response to shareholder pressure on arbitration. For years, Goldman had mandatory arbitration for employment disputes, concealing issues like harassment or bias from public view. After public criticism and investor questions, Goldman in 2022 to 2023 reviewed its arbitration policy. There's a report on their site about reviewing the program. Lo and behold, in 2023, Goldman announced that it would end mandatory arbitration for sexual harassment cases following its industry peers. This shows the bylaws or policies can change, but typically only under significant pressure. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM assigns a bylaw fortification index of positive 0.10 for Goldman Sachs. This relatively low positive score reflects that Goldman's formal governance provisions are only mildly fortified in management's favor. They have many standard shareholder rights in place: annual elections, proxy access, no supermajority requirements, so we do not give a large positive or entrenching value here. The positive 0.10 indicates a slight bias toward entrenchment, acknowledging the limitations on special meetings and written consent, as well as the practical reality that the board can still unilaterally tweak bylaws. Essentially, Goldman's BFI is close to neutral, especially when compared to firms previously mentioned on this podcast. It's worth noting that Goldman's bylaw fortification index being near zero suggests that if shareholders did organize en masse, the rulebook would not stop them. Only the players would. The dry irony here is that Goldman's rules are decent, but its outcomes, with few challenges to management, resemble those of far more fortified companies. The difference lies in execution, which is captured in other metrics. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 3, the Shareholder Hostility Quotient, or SHQ. By definition, the Shareholder Hostility Quotient evaluates management's and the board's attitude and responsiveness toward shareholder concerns, essentially how, quote, shareholder-friendly, unquote, or hostile the company is in practice. This includes management's track record on engaging with shareholder proposals, receptiveness to investor feedback, and any measures taken to undermine shareholder rights, like stonewalling activists by using aggressive tactics against dissenting investors, etc. A higher shareholder hostility quotient implies a more hostile stance, such as when management tends to resist or rebuff shareholders' input, potentially impacting public trust, whereas a negative or low shareholder hostility quotient would indicate a management often aligning with or readily addressing shareholder interests. Per the Proxyopoly TM analysis, Goldman Sachs' relationship with its shareholders can be characterized as politely distant, occasionally contentious, yet rarely overtly combative. The firm isn't known for public spats with activist investors, unlike, say, ExxonMobil's clash with Engine Number 1. Instead, Goldman projects an image of smooth investor relations. But beneath the cordial surface, the board's inclination is to firmly quash any shareholder initiative not to its liking. Let's look at the evidence. In its shareholder proposals, for the past several years, Goldman shareholders have brought forth a variety of proposals on governance and environmental social governance topics like ESG. The board has uniformly recommended against essentially all of them except its own management proposals. For example, at the 2023 annual general meeting, shareholders submitted proposals for a lobbying report, an independent chair policy, a racial equity audit, a fossil fuel lending phase-out, and 2030 greenhouse gas targets. The board opposed every single one. None passed. As noted earlier, support ranged from approximately 7% to 16% votable shares outstanding. Goldman's management could have chosen to endorse or negotiate on some of these. Some banks have agreed to limited racial equity audits under pressure, for instance, but Goldman did not. The racial equity audit proposal got 11.5% support, even after management said no, meaning a not insignificant minority of investors wanted an independent check on the firm's impact on communities of color. Goldman responded by issuing an internal report on its efforts for racial equity, but stopping short of agreeing to the independent audit as requested. This indicates a measured hostility. Rather than outright refusal to acknowledge an issue, Goldman often opts for a half step that falls short of shareholder demands. Engagement versus enforcement within the context of the shareholder hostility quotient includes Goldman's leadership often talking about how they will engage with shareholders. For instance, when adopting proxy access in 2015, Goldman's press release noted, quote, "We engaged our shareholders and those discussions were a critical factor, ... unquote. They also regularly meet with major investors through governance roadshows. However, these engagements do not necessarily translate into accepting shareholder ideas. They are more about persuading investors of the board's viewpoint. A telling sign of hostility is the fate of the independent chair proposal. After it got approximately 16% support from outstanding votable shares in 2023, the logical next step in engagement would be to discuss compromises, like appointing a strong lead independent director with defined powers or committing to revisit the combined role when David Solomon's tenure ends. Instead, Goldman's board effectively shrugged at the vote. David Solomon remains chairman and CEO, and the latest proxy statement did not signal any intent to revisit the structure. In fact, the board highlighted that shareholders, quote, overwhelmingly, unquote, support current governance, pointing to the 84% that did not vote for the independent chair as a validation. That framing, focusing on who didn't dissent, underscores a somewhat dismissive attitude to dissenting voices. Executive compensation and shareholder input within the context of the shareholder hostility quotient. One area shareholders do have a say is, say, on pay. Here, Goldman hasn't faced rebellion. Quite the opposite. Over 93% approved the pay package in 2023. But how did the board respond in a year such as 2022 when performance was down and Solomon's strategy was stumbling? They did cut Solomon's pay by about 30% for 2022 from $35 million to $25 million amid lower profits and layoffs. Arguably, that shows some alignment with shareholder interest, but not exactly hostility. Yet cynics might note that Goldman's comp is famously generous to top brass. The cut was more symbolic. David Solomon still made $25 million for a year of missteps in the consumer banking venture. Shareholders have been relatively quiescent on pay, so the board hasn't been tested here. No hostility because no pushback. We'd call it a truce. Treatment of activist investors in the context of the shareholder hostility quotient. While no major activist campaigns have targeted Goldman's board seats, we can gauge management's stance through related incidents. Consider the case of investor activist James McRitchie, a retail shareholder advocate who often files governance proposals. In 2024, McRitchie filed an innovative proposal at Goldman and Bank of America, asking them to consider offering, quote, proxy voting choice, unquote, to their own investors in index funds. Since Goldman Sachs has an asset management arm, this granular proxy voting concept was inspired by BlackRock's move to let its institutional clients direct votes. Goldman's board opposed the idea, and it did not pass. The board's stance: they don't want to dilute their control or complicate voting by empowering underlying investors, a stance arguably against the democratization trend. Another instance is when the National Institute for Workers' Rights, or NIWR, wrote to Goldman's board in 2023 urging the firm to stop donating to anti-DEI groups via its donor-advised funds. Goldman's response was non-committal publicly, suggesting that as long as it's legal, they won't police the ideologies of donation recipients too strictly. This could be seen as prioritizing business as usual and appeasing conservative clients over the vocal concerns of certain shareholder advocacy groups, a subtle rebuff, if you will. Handling of public criticism in the context of the shareholder hostility quotient. Shareholders are increasingly concerned with reputational and cultural issues. Goldman's leadership has shown a bit of a tin ear at times. For example, 2022 was marred by reports of internal discontent and high turnover post-COVID, as Goldman pushed for a strict return to office and cut jobs. Rather than acknowledge these morale issues proactively, David Solomon brushed them off in public and insisted on office attendance while reportedly flying to DJ gigs on the weekends. Optics that did not go unnoticed by investors concerned with human capital management. This isn't direct shareholder hostility, but it shows a degree of insularity. The CEO and board risk appearing out of touch with rank-and-file concerns, which can bleed into investor concerns about talent retention. Some positive notes in the shareholder hostility quotient. To be fair, Goldman isn't the most shareholder hostile company out there. It doesn't have a controlling family thumbing its nose at minority investors, nor does it engage in open warfare with activists or frivolous litigation to block votes. In fact, when engine number one shook ExxonMobil's board in 2021 by electing 3 new directors on a climate platform, Goldman's asset management arm, GSAM, actually voted for engine number one's nominees, siding against ExxonMobil's management. That shows Goldman, as an investor, can support shareholder insurgencies elsewhere. But when it comes to its own governance, Goldman prefers a controlled, top-down approach. The overall pattern is that Goldman's board and management tolerate shareholder voices as a procedural formality, but rarely embrace them. When faced with shareholder requests, the default response is a polite rejection or a watered-down compromise on the firm's own terms. There is a hint of, quote, "Papa knows best," unquote, in Goldman's dealings. The idea that management and the board believe they ultimately know what's best for the firm, and perhaps by extension, the market. And shareholders should simply trust them. This paternalistic stance is a form of hostility in that it downplays legitimate external input. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM assigns Goldman Sachs a shareholder hostility quotient of positive 0.40. This indicates a discernible tilt towards resisting shareholder influence. It's not an extreme above 1.00 or more, which would imply open antagonism or chronic activist battles, but positive 0.40 reflects that Goldman's management generally meets shareholder initiatives with skepticism or opposition rather than enthusiasm. By comparison, it's telling that among tech peers, Amazon's shareholder hostility quotient was in a similar ballpark as Amazon routinely squelched shareholder proposals on human rights and climate. Goldman is behaving much like those companies in this regard. A negative shareholder hostility quotient, on the other hand, would indicate management is friendly to shareholders and reserved for cases like a company that proactively implements shareholder suggestions or hardly ever faces opposition. Goldman certainly doesn't fit that description. The modest irony is that Goldman's own asset management division expects the companies it invests in to listen to shareholders on environmental, social, and governance issues. Yet Goldman's board, in practice, often gives its own shareholders the cold shoulder. The Proxyopoly TM rating for the shareholder hostility quotient of positive 0.40 captures that irony in numeric form. And now moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 4. The executive entrenchment factor, or EIF. By definition, the executive entrenchment factor gauges how entrenched the executive leadership is. Do the CEO and top team have outsized influence and job security that insulate them from accountability? Contributing factors include combined CEO and chair roles, long CEO tenure without clear succession, golden parachutes or contractual safeguards, insider dominance on the board, and a culture of deference to executives. A high EIF suggests the executives are dug in like Alabama ticks, resistant to removal or challenge. A low, even negative EIF would mean leadership turnover is more frequent or power is more balanced. Perhaps a strong independent board that could dethrone a CEO if needed. In Proxyopoly TM analysis, Goldman Sachs has historically been a firm where executive entrenchment is high, albeit cloaked in a veneer of meritocracy. The company's partnership roots meant that for most of its history, leaders rose from within and served at the pleasure of their fellow partners. As a public company, however, Goldman still draws its CEO from an inner circle, and they wield considerable power. Let's break down current and recent situations. The dual role of CEO chairperson David Solomon. As noted earlier, David Solomon serves as both chairperson and CEO. This consolidates leadership power. Solomon effectively sets the board's agenda and presides over meetings, meaning he can control information flow to directors to some extent. Such duality is a classic entrenchment red flag in governance. Shareholders have no realistic chance to install an independent chair unless Solomon agrees or steps down. The board's refusal to even consider splitting the roles, despite some investor agitation, reinforces that Solomon has the board's backing to remain king of the castle. Board composition and independence in consideration for the executive entrenchment factor. Of 14 directors, 2 are current executives. Solomon and Waldron, and one is a former longtime executive, Viniar. Having over 20% of the board composed of current or ex-management tilts the dynamic in favor of the CEO. President John Waldron's appointment in 2025 is notable. As president and chief operating officer, he's Solomon's number 2 and a potential successor. Now given a board seat, quote, a month after he was given a retention bonus, unquote, this move can be seen as both succession planning and further executive entrenchment. By adding Waldron, the board has effectively welcomed Solomon's top lieutenant into the governing body, cementing the current leadership's influence. As one banking analyst quipped, it, quote, further cements management's control. The circle of trust closes tighter, unquote. Waldron's presence means any boardroom discussions of Solomon's performance now happens with Solomon and his closest ally in the room. This can inhibit frank discussion of leadership change. Tenure and succession in consideration for the executive entrenchment factor include how long do Goldman CEOs stick around? Historically, quite long, but not excessively so. Solomon became CEO in 2018, so he's 7 years in. Not very long yet. His predecessor, Lloyd Blankfein, served 12 years as CEO and 6 more as Chairman Emeritus. CEOs at Goldman Sachs tend to have extended tenures, around a decade-ish, often coinciding with strong influence. There's usually an heir apparent internally, as Solomon was to Blankfein, and Waldron is likely to Solomon. However, the succession is tightly managed by the outgoing CEO and board leadership, often with limited external input. It's noteworthy that even when Blankfein faced criticism around 1MDB and post-crisis, he held on until he chose to retire, and the board never publicly wavered in support. Similarly, any chatter about Solomon's missteps, for example, the bungled consumer banking strategy resulting in billions in losses, has not translated into any hint of him being shown the door. Instead, reports suggest internal dissatisfaction, but the board publicly gave Solomon votes of confidence and even a big raise in good years. Compensation and incentives in consideration for the executive entrenchment factor include one measure of entrenchment is whether executives use the company as a personal fiefdom. Goldman isn't known for egregious personal perks or nepotism at the top. It's too high profile to get away with it, say hiring the CEO's unqualified relatives, for example. However, cultural entrenchment is evident. Goldman CEOs historically wield outsized influence, not just in the company, but in industry and government. Think of ex-CEOs like Hank Paulson becoming U.S. Treasury Secretary. This revolving door can contribute to a sense that Goldman's leaders are almost statesmen, not easily unseated. The board is often filled with luminaries and allies who revere the institution's leadership. For example, board member Lakshmi Mittal, an industry titan in his own right, is unlikely to rock the boat. He's part of a mutual admiration society of global CEOs. This dynamic can reduce critical oversight. Golden parachutes and clawbacks are in consideration for the executive entrenchment factor. Goldman's executive contracts aren't public, but big banks commonly have standard change in control severance packages, which rarely get triggered given no takeovers, and robust deferred stock that vests over years. Goldman did enforce clawbacks after 1MDB. As noted, $174 million was clawed back from executives, including Blankfein and others. That shows the board can penalize executives in extreme cases, but one could argue that was closing the barn door after the horse bolted. In terms of deterrence to mismanagement, the fact that Blankfein kept his job through that saga until he was ready to go implies a pretty thick layer of Teflon on Goldman's leadership. Accountability mechanisms also in consideration for the executive entrenchment factor. Consider how easily or not a CEO could be removed. At Goldman, to remove Solomon, it would likely require a major scandal or sustained poor performance and loss of confidence by the inner circle. Shareholders alone can't do it. They'd have to persuade the board. The board's composition, as we've learned, is CEO-friendly. So unless Solomon seriously jeopardizes the franchise, which would turn even his allies against him, he's secure. Contrast this with, say, Wells Fargo's board ousting CEO John Stumpf in 2016 after the fake accounts scandal. That happened under intense regulatory and public pressure. If Goldman faced a crisis of similar magnitude, would its board act decisively? Possibly. But given past form, they might initially try to shield and support the CEO longer. There's a touch of irony that Goldman is quick to advise clients to make hard changes, but internally it is slow to remove its own leaders. Anecdotally, executive entrenchment at Goldman is epitomized by the figure of Stephen Friedman decades ago. He was both senior partner and later board member, part of the Goldman, quote, old guard, unquote, that influenced the firm long after retirement. Today's equivalent might be someone like John Rogers, not on the board, but a longtime insider who's been the, quote, chief of staff, unquote, and advisor to multiple CEOs. These figures help perpetuate a continuity of thought at the top, great for stability, less great for fresh perspectives. One must also mention the Solomon DJ factor, not just for humor, but as a cultural indicator. Despite some embarrassment among colleagues over Solomon's high-profile disc jockey gigs, which at times drew media snark about whether his priorities were straight, the board's stance was tolerant. If anything, directors privately attended some of his events. This informality suggests the board is personally friendly to the CEO, which can dull their critical edge, a hallmark of entrenchment. The CEO's outside hobbies or minor controversies, like reports of him using Goldman's private jet to fly to a Hamptons DJ event and making co-workers uncomfortable with weekend demands, did not lead to any public reprimand. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM assigns an executive entrenchment factor of positive 0.85 to Goldman Sachs. This relatively high Proxyopoly TM rating indicates that Goldman's top executives, especially the CEO chairperson, David Solomon, are very securely positioned and wield extensive influence with minimal immediate threat of removal. The Proxyopoly rating of positive 0.85 for the executive entrenchment factor is close to the upper end of the scale, but not a full 1.00 or more, which we'd reserve for, say, a founder CEO with majority voting power such as Mike Zuckerberg, with over 1.00 in the executive entrenchment factor. In Proxyopoly TM terms, practically irremovable. But positive 0.85 is lower than what we scored for companies like Alphabet in the executive entrenchment factor, whereas Larry Page and Sergey Brin's entrenchment was sky high, mitigated only by their semi-retirement. We gave Alphabet's around positive 1.90 since dual-class shares gave founders unchecked control. Goldman's entrenchment is of a different style, more of a cozy club than a legal lock. Hence lower than Alphabet's, but still significant. Executive entrenchment factor for Goldman Sachs is notably higher than, say, Microsoft, whose was positive 0.40 in our prior analysis. Microsoft's leadership, while powerful, operates under a stronger independent board ethos and has seen smooth, planned transitions. Nadella succeeded Ballmer with board asserting itself. Goldman's of positive 0.85 reflects that its leadership change only happens when blessed by existing leadership, and that executives face limited accountability day to day. If one were to make a dry, ironic observation in this podcast, Goldman CEO could almost underperform with impunity for a while, as long as it's not catastrophic, and still not worry about being dethroned immediately. That's how snugly that chair is bolted to the floor. Moving on to the fifth and final Proxyopoly TM rating underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score is the Regulatory Evasion Measure, or REM. By definition, the Regulatory Evasion Measure assesses the company's propensity and ability to evade, circumvent, or influence regulations and oversight. This includes exploiting loopholes, lobbying aggressively for favorable rules, skirting close to legal lines, and how often the firm is penalized by regulators. It's essentially a measure of how much the company treats regulation as a negotiable obstacle rather than a binding mandate. A higher regulatory evasion measure means the company frequently finds ways around rules or pushes the envelope of legality, which can harm public interest. Whereas a low or negative regulatory evasion measure means the company is scrupulous and compliant rather than pushing limits. In Proxyopoly TM analysis, Goldman Sachs, as a major financial institution, operates under extensive regulation, and yet its history is replete with instances of regulatory arbitrage, influence, and occasional outright breaches. It is often said Goldman doesn't break the rules, it makes the rules, via lobbying or having alumni in regulatory positions. Of course, reality is more complex. But Goldman's savvy in negotiating regulation is legendary, sometimes infamously so. The lobbying and influence taken into consideration for the regulatory evasion measure include Goldman spending millions on lobbying each year. Its cadre in government is so infamously nicknamed Government Sachs. From former CEO Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary during the 2008 crisis, to alumni like Gary Gensler, the precarious SEC chair, and Stephen Mnuchin, another Treasury Secretary. Goldman's network is vast. This revolving door has often allowed Goldman a seat at the table when rules are written. For example, during the Dodd-Frank Act deliberations post-2008, Goldman lobbied on derivatives regulation. It succeeded in preserving certain trading activities in-house by moving them to its insured bank entity, a controversial end run that other banks also utilized. When Volcker Rule, which limits proprietary trading, came out, Goldman reportedly adjusted by labeling some activities as, quote, market making, unquote, which was allowed, rather than prop trading, which is banned, exploiting the rule's gray zones. In 2019, when Goldman's lobbying helped water down parts of the Volcker Rule during regulatory rollbacks, this ability to shape rules in its favor, often under the radar, is a hallmark of a high regulatory evasion measure. Exploiting loopholes is also under consideration for the regulatory evasion measure. A famous case of legal cleverness. In the late 2000s, Goldman helped hedge funds and large investors avoid public disclosure of big stock positions by using complex swaps. The so-called, quote, Goldman Sachs 13F workaround, unquote. Institutional investors must disclose holdings on Form 13F. Goldman created swap agreements that gave the economic exposure without actual share ownership on record, concealing the position. This came to light with Warren Buffett's trades being hidden by Goldman via an SEC no-action letter. While not illegal, it was certainly regulatory arbitrage, using the letter of the law to defeat its spirit. Another example prior to 2008, Goldman deftly skirted bank holding company regulation by being an investment bank, but when the financial crisis hit, it converted to a bank holding company overnight to access federal lending. Then, chafing under some bank regulations, it found ways to continue riskier trading within its new structure by leveraging less regulated entities overseas or shifting assets. Goldman's legal department is arguably as profit-generating as its trading desk in terms of finding ways to reduce capital requirements or avoid restrictions, all within legal bounds until they are not. Regulatory penalties and compliance issues are also under consideration for the regulatory evasion measure. When Goldman's risk-taking crosses into rule-breaking, it has faced enforcement. We discussed the 1MDB scandal. Here, Goldman bankers blatantly violated anti-bribery laws, resulting in parent company charges that massive $2.9 billion payout. The fact that Goldman, of all firms, got embroiled in a colossal bribery case indicates a certain hubris, a belief they could get away with facilitating fraud in a sovereign fund, perhaps due to their clout. The deferred prosecution agreement forced Goldman to tighten compliance, but one wonders if without external whistleblowers and global media, would Goldman have self-policed? Unlikely. Goldman has also had run-ins with regulators on conflicts of interest. In 2016, it paid $120 million to settle federal allegations of improper handling of its confidential Fed information. A Goldman banker got Fed secrets from a friend at the New York Fed, showing a cozy relationship that went awry. In 2020, Goldman paid $100 million to New York regulators for failing to monitor a rogue FX trader, a compliance gap. And recently, Goldman Sachs Asset Management, GSAM, was fined $4 million by the Securities and Exchange Commission for failures in its ESG funds policies. Goldman Sachs Asset Management marketed ESG products without proper procedures to ensure they met ESG criteria, effectively not following its own stated products. This 2022 penalty, though small in dollars, underscores a willingness to push trendy products out even if internal controls aren't fully baked. A mild form of evading the spirit of disclosure rules. Dodging and weaving also under consideration for the regulatory evasion measure. Goldman is adept at risk transference, offloading or spreading risks to avoid regulatory capital hits. Goldman was a big user of AIG's credit default swaps, CDS, to hedge subprime exposure pre-2008. When AIG faltered, Goldman was made whole largely via the government's AIG bailout, sparking outrage that taxpayer money indirectly saved Goldman. Though Goldman claimed it was hedged, the optics were bad. Post-crisis, Goldman shrank its balance sheet risk in some areas to appease regulators, but ramped up less visible exposure. For instance, it became a major commodities player, owning metal warehouses, oil storage, etc., until pressure forced it to exit some commodity activities around 2014. It tested boundaries on whether banks should be in physical commodities, profiting from a gray area in federal regulations allowing, quote, complementary, unquote, commodities activities. Recent maneuvers, also taken into consideration for the regulatory evasion measure. The Net Zero Banking Alliance exit, mentioned earlier, is a sort of regulatory evasion in the environmental social governance ESG domain. By quitting the NZBA, Goldman sidestepped voluntary but increasingly expected obligations to align lending with climate goals. They cited legal pressures, antitrust fears from red state politicians, a valid concern, but the move conveniently frees Goldman from public scrutiny under that alliance's framework. They can still say they'll meet climate goals, but without that external accountability. This shows a readiness to step back from commitments that become inconvenient. Technically legal, but arguably evasive regarding global climate coordination. Another current example, Goldman's quick compliance with rolling back diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI targets after the most recent regime change in the executive branch. Rather than test the legal limits or defend their diversity goals, Goldman promptly, quote, made adjustments, unquote. This could be seen as regulatory or political evasion for self-protection. They chose the path of least resistance, perhaps to avoid becoming a target. In doing so, they effectively diluted a transparency measure, public diversity targets, that investors and employees had valued. We should note Goldman's positive steps here too, because it's not all evasion. There are two sides to every coin. They did implement stricter compliance programs after 1MDB and Volcker. They do often cooperate with regulators. Solomon has a decent relationship with the Fed, notably. But the culture is one of finding a way to say yes on business, even if it means dragging regulators to that yes. An example, Goldman reportedly led the charge in crypto trading among banks while others hesitated due to unclear rules. Goldman quietly explored crypto derivatives, pushing boundaries but not overtly violating any rules since rules were sparse. They want to be in lucrative markets first, and worry about the rules as an afterthought, or negotiate them as they go. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM assigns Goldman Sachs a regulatory evasion measure of positive 1.10. This high positive score, above 1.00, indicates Goldman has a strong tendency to test, influence, and occasionally breach regulatory constraints. This Proxyopoly TM rating is on the upper end of the spectrum because of high-profile incidents like 1MDB's criminal breach, combined with routine maneuvering, lobbying, loopholes, and shaping rules. For perspective, this is higher than the regulatory evasion measure we gave for BlackRock, which was positive 0.64, since BlackRock, while influential in policy, usually stays well within the rules. Goldman's regulatory evasion measure is also higher than ExxonMobil's, which was positive 0.60. Exxon pushes back on climate rules and had decades of client climate suppression, but it generally follows hard law in operation. Generally. Goldman's regulatory evasion measure of positive 1.10 puts it near the top among firms previously analyzed, akin to some big tech companies that have repeatedly clashed with regulators globally, some mentioned on this podcast. Indeed, one could analogize Goldman's regulatory finesse to Alphabet, which had an REM of positive 1.60 in our review for antitrust evasions and privacy sidestepping. Goldman approaches that high score due to its direct role in financial crises and scandals with systemic impact on the public health of free markets. In free market public health terms, Goldman's regulatory evasion can contribute to systemic risk or unfair advantages. Thus, a single proxy vote, if it could rein in Goldman's risk-taking, carries a lot of weight. But such votes rarely materialize due to previously mentioned metrics. The irony here is that Goldman often positions itself as a champion of well-regulated markets, whereas CEO David Solomon frequently calls for modernizing regulations, etc., yet time and again it finds itself paying fines for compliance failures or quietly sidestepping inconvenient rules. The Proxyopoly TM rating for the regulatory evasion measure of positive 1.10 is a numeric nod to that split personality at Goldman Sachs. Having now established the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings underlying the overlaying Proxyopoly TM score for Goldman Sachs, We will now take a little intermission to allow time for the Proxyopolists at home to digest the information they have heard prior to the proprietary calculation of said Proxyopoly TM score for Goldman Sachs. And now, without any further delay, a word from our sponsors. Hi, my name is Jessica Burdick, owner of the trademark of Proxyopoly, the trademark which protects the podcast you are listening to now. In addition to all the above-the-ears mustard shit like the proprietary intellectual property stuff, but we won't even get into that at the moment. I'm here to talk about procuring advertisement opportunities for the Proxyopolists at home to have their product and or service featured on this podcast as sponsored content and or contributed content. So if you think this is you, and you want your product and or service featured on this podcast, Proxyopoly TM is once again procuring advertisement opportunities. But perhaps in vain, because again, who would want their product and service on here when I'm roasting the boards of companies? Again, select the Contact Proxyopoly TM option on the Linktree at linktree/NASCARCosa. Enjoy the Proxyopoly TM score for Goldman Sachs, Proxyopolis. And we're back. And now returning to the subject of this podcast, we turn to Section 3 of the Proxyopoly TM research report for Goldman Sachs, which is the final Proxyopoly TM score for Goldman Sachs. Having analyzed the 5 underlying Proxyopoly TM ratings, we now calculate Goldman Sachs' final Proxyopoly TM score as the weighted average of the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings, which to recap are as follows. For proxy accumulation resistance, Goldman Sachs has scored a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.65. For the Bylaw Fortification Index, Goldman Sachs has scored a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.10. For the Shareholder Hostility Quotient, Goldman Sachs has scored a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.40. For the Executive Entrenchment Factor, or ETH, Goldman Sachs has scored a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.85. For the regulatory evasion measure, Goldman Sachs has scored a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 1.10. And to compute the final Proxyopoly TM score, Proxyopoly TM will now begin its proprietary calculation methodology for computing said final Proxyopoly TM score. The final Proxyopoly TM score for Goldman Sachs is positive 0.62. Goldman Sachs' final Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.62 indicates a relatively high degree of Proxyopoly TM style influence and entrenchment. In the unofficial, quote, game, unquote, of Proxyopoly TM, Goldman Sachs clearly owns some expensive properties on the board and is adept at dodging the chance cards, so to speak. A Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.62 suggests the volatility impact of a single proxy vote at Goldman in terms of shaking up management's grip and thus benefiting public market health is positively correlated with systemic inertia. In plain language, each shareholder vote at Goldman has a modest uphill battle to change anything, and the status quo power structure tends to win out, often to the detriment of broader transparency or accountability. In summary, Goldman's Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.62 places it in the middle to upper tier of Proxyopoly TM scores among large corporations previously analyzed. It's not the absolute worst case, with some tech firms possessing dual-class shares or founder emperors ranking high, and with Proxyopoly TM scores near or above positive 1.00, but it's certainly well above a neutral 0.00. It indicates that Goldman Sachs is a solid, quote, blue property, unquote, on the Proxyopoly TM board. Not a boardwalk or park place, perhaps, but an expensive property that's tough for other players or shareholders to land on and proactively change. There is irony in the fact that Goldman Sachs, famed for its risk management, also expertly manages the risk of shareholder democracy breaking out. A final Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.62 also suggests implications for public health in free markets. Decisions at Goldman Sachs, like how it allocates capital, treats clients, or manages risk, are made within a relatively insulated governance structure. The general public and diversified investors have limited leverage to course-correct Goldman Sachs if it were to veer into socially harmful territory, such as excessive risk, contributing to systemic instability, or ethical lapses. We saw a glimpse of that in 2008. Had shareholders been more empowered at Goldman, could they have reined in some of the pre-crisis excess? Possibly. With a Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.62, Goldman Sachs' governance still leans towards insularity, which means the burden falls more on regulators and public outcry to keep it in check, rather than on internal shareholder governance mechanisms. The final Proxyopoly TM score therefore encapsulates our findings. Goldman Sachs has a firmly entrenched governance system that modestly exceeds the norm in resisting outside influence and accountability. In the context of free markets, this entrenchment can contribute to systemic rigidity. The firm is less susceptible to healthy discipline than activist investors or voting outcomes might otherwise enforce. Shareholders in Goldman's case often play a ceremonial role. True power rests with a small cadre of insiders and sympathetic institutions. In the next sections of this podcast, we will transition from a diagnosis to prescription. Knowing Goldman's Proxyopoly TM profile, what reforms could unlock some value and public good? And how should shareholders approach the upcoming annual general meeting votes to promote these reforms? Proxyopoly TM will recommend changes to chip away at that positive 0.62 Proxyopoly TM score and ideally nudge it down closer to zero over time. Lastly, Proxyopoly TM will provide voting guidance on how to vote on the re-election of each director at the upcoming annual general meeting for Goldman Sachs. Moving on to section 4 of this podcast, titled Governance Policy Change Recommendations. The Proxyopoly TM analysis reveals clear areas where Goldman Sachs and its governance falls short of best practice. To reduce entrenchment and better align the firm with shareholder and stakeholder interests, not to mention to dial down that Proxyopoly TM score, Proxyopoly TM proposes the following governance reform recommendations. These changes are tailored to Goldman's specific shortcomings and are grounded in both Proxyopoly TM principles and real-world precedents. Each recommendation is presented with factual justification and a touch of irony that Goldman's situation invites. Governance policy change recommendation number 1. Split the chairperson and CEO roles. Establish an independent chair. Proxyopoly TM's formal recommendation is to amend Goldman's leadership structure so that the chair of the board is an independent director, not concurrently the CEO. This could be implemented by policy, board resolution, or ultimately a shareholder proposal if the board resists. The board should commit that upon the next CEO transition or sooner, the roles will be separated. In the interim, empower the lead independent director with expanded duties, approval of agendas, ability to call executive sessions, etc. Rationale: Goldman's combined CEO chair role is a linchpin of executive entrenchment and contributes to the proxy accumulation resistance by centralizing agenda control. An independent chair would provide stronger oversight of management, set a more balanced tone in board discussions, and serve as a direct conduit for shareholder concerns. Nearly 59% of S&P 500 firms now separate the roles or have a lead director with robust powers. reflecting evolving best practice. Goldman is behind the curve here. In 2023, a shareholder proposal for an independent chair, although rejected, signaled discontent with 39.9 million votes in favor. That's not trivial. That's many major investors saying, quote, "We want a check on David Solomon's power," unquote. The board's current stance that the status quo is fine because a majority voted against the proposal misses the point that 16% voted for it despite management's opposition. By proactively adopting this change, Goldman can demonstrate responsiveness. It might even stave off future, potentially higher votes on the issue as investor focus on board leadership intensifies across the market. An independent chair is particularly warranted given Goldman's recent missteps. For example, the costly consumer banking foray. If nothing else, Mr. Solomon might concentrate better on remixing financial strategies if he's also not remixing vinyl on the weekends and running board meetings. A separate chair could politely remind him his day job is a priority. Governance policy change recommendation number 2, institute a mandatory retirement age or term limits for directors to enforce refreshment. Proxyopoly TM recommendation is to implement a clear policy that directors must retire from the board at or before the age of 75 and consider a term limit of approximately 15 years for board service. For Goldman Sachs, which already has some aging directors, this means planning succession for long-tenured members like Lakshmi Mittal and executing on existing retirement norms. Goldman's corporate governance guidelines hint at 75 as a retirement age, but apparently it's not strictly enforced yet. If waivers are currently allowed, eliminate or tightly limit them. Additionally, aim to add at least one new independent director each year for the next few years to infuse fresh perspectives. This can dovetail with diversity objectives as well. Proxyopoly TM's rationale is that a number of Goldman directors have lengthy tenures and advanced ages, which can hinder board dynamicism and accountability. For instance, Lakshmi Mittal has been on the board since 2008 and is now 75. Typically the age at which many boards usher members out. Kullman is 68 and has served over 6 years. David Viniar is 68 and has served since 2013. While experience is valuable, a steady pace of refreshment prevents groupthink and excessive deference to management born of long personal relationships. Institutional Shareholder Services, or ISS, a proxy advisor, noted in a 2022 report that companies with staggered refreshment and diverse appointments tend to outperform and face fewer governance crises. Goldman's own history shows the perils of insularity. Recall that during the 1MDB scandal years, the board included several members who had been there over a decade, possibly too comfortable to spot or challenge the red flags. Retirement age of 75 aligns with common practice. Many boards choose 72 or 75. Term limits like 15 years ensure turnover even if ages are still under the limit. By enforcing these, Goldman can gracefully rotate out directors who may be clinging on. Politely, perhaps, they, quote, enjoy the prestige of the Goldman board a bit too much, unquote. New blood on the board will bring in updated skill sets, such as fintech, cybersecurity, whereas, for example, Jan Tighe was a good addition in that regard. In fact, Goldman Sachs has just added Casey McClure, aged 59, a former Accenture CFO in 2025, a positive step in this regard. We suggest at Proxyopoly continuing that trajectory at Goldman Sachs. Shareholders are increasingly scrutinizing board tenure. This policy would preempt any investor push. For example, the New York City Comptroller's Office has pressured companies on overly long board tenures in the past. And as a fringe benefit, rotating off some of the long-tenured directors, especially ex-Goldman insiders, could reduce the old boy and old girl network effect that currently bolsters management's stance. A refreshed board might even revisit decisions like combining the chair and CEO roles. Governance policy change recommendation number 3. Revamp shareholder engagement and transparency on key issues, such as climate, diversity, equity, inclusion, and lobbying. Proxyopoly TM recommendation: adopt a more transparent and receptive approach to environmental social governance issues and political disclosure issues that shareholders care about. Concretely, publish an annual report disclosing direct and indirect lobbying expenditures and policy positions, addressing the ask of past shareholder proposals on lobbying. Strengthen commitments to climate action by rejoining or emulating frameworks like the Net Zero Banking Alliance. If full membership is unattainable due to legal fears, then set equivalent public targets for financed emissions and report progress annually in a matrix comparable to NZBA requirements. Also, reinstate and publicly post diversity goals for workforce composition, even if phrased carefully to comply with the law, for example, aspirational targets with reference to merits of diversity, to signal that Goldman will not backtrack on diversity, equity, inclusion despite political pressure. Furthermore, commit to conduct an independent racial equity audit by third parties in 2025, addressing the spirit of the shareholder proposal that got 11.5% support from outstanding votable shares. Announce that the findings will be made public and any recommendations will be considered by the board. This rationale is based on the fact that much of Goldman's shareholder hostility, whereas there's a shareholder hostility quotient of positive 0.40, has manifested in the firm defensively opposing proposals on climate, diversity, equity, inclusion, and lobbying transparency, only to later take half steps in private, for example, internal reports, or to quietly withdraw commitments like erasing diversity targets. This creates a trust deficit. By proactively adopting some of these measures, Goldman can reduce friction with shareholders and improve its public image. For instance, investors representing trillions like BlackRock, New York State Common Retirement Fund, etc., routinely vote for lobbying disclosure proposals at companies. By volunteering such disclosure, Goldman earns goodwill and may avoid a proposal coming up again. As for climate, yes, Goldman left the NZBA citing legal concerns, but nothing prevents it from independently aligning with Paris goals. Shareholders concerned with climate risk, which is a growing portion of the base, will press Goldman on financed emission targets sooner or later. If Goldman sets clear 2030 interim targets and discloses its progress, say how it's reducing carbon intensity of lending in power, oil and gas, etc., as it mentioned qualitatively, it can appease climate-conscious investors and mitigate the chance of an engine number one style campaign in the banking sector. On DEI, the quiet removal of diversity goals from the 10K in 2025 was noticed. Indeed, Fortune and Bloomberg made it public. Rather than retreating, Goldman should double down on its internal diversity efforts and communicate them within whatever is legally permissible post-executive order. After all, 98% of shareholders voted to continue DEI programs when anti-DEI activists challenged him. Shareholders clearly want Goldman to uphold these values, so the board should treat diversity and inclusion as strategic priorities, not political hot potatoes. An independent racial equity audit, as some peers have done, would demonstrate seriousness in addressing any systemic biases. Important after the $215 million gender bias settlement and additional claims of discrimination. These recommendations from such an audit could help Goldman improve culture and avoid future costly lawsuits. Embracing transparency and engagement on these fronts will likely lower shareholder hostility. Instead of voting against proposals, management might start dialoguing on how to implement them in a reasonable way. This shift could gradually change Goldman's shareholder hostility quotient metric from positive, within the resistance area, toward negative in the alignment area. Think of it this way. Better to get ahead of the pitchforks before they arrive, and Goldman can afford a lantern or two to light the path. Governance policy change recommendation number 4. Enhance board independence and accountability. Refresh committees and consider shareholder-nominated candidates. Reconstitute key board committees, such as governance and nominating, audit, risk, compensation, with an eye toward including newer, truly independent voices as chairs. For example, have a relatively new director like Kimberly Harris, who joined in 2018 with utility executive legal background, or Casey McClure, who joined in 2025 to take on governance committee chairmanship, who's been there over 10 years. Similarly, ensure the risk committee has someone chairing it who is not a former Goldman partner. Currently, if a figure like David Viniar is involved, consider rotating him out in favor of someone like Jan Tighe or Mark Flaherty, who have no past entanglement with Goldman's risk mishaps. Additionally, the board should declare that it will give serious consideration to any director candidates put forth via proxy access or by significant shareholders and not reflexively oppose them. In fact, Goldman could go further and designate one board seat to be a sort of, quote, shareholder representative, unquote. Not legally binding, but by understanding that when credible investor groups put up a nominee through the 3% 3-year channel, the board will welcome that person if elected rather than treat them as an adversary. The rationale being the board independence in substance, not in form, is crucial. At Goldman, the presence of ex-executives and the longevity of certain directors raises questions about whether the board can objectively challenge management. By rotating committee chairs, you prevent any single director from accumulating too much informal power and complacency. For instance, if the audit committee were chaired for a decade by the same person, that person might be too cozy with the chief financial officer. A rotation injects fresh diligence. Empowering newer directors sends a message that the board values independent thinking over old loyalties. A case in point. If governance committee is led by someone who's been on the board since the 2000s, how likely are they to suddenly decide to replace their old friend, the CEO? Unlikely. Putting a newer, diverse director in charge and the calculus might change to, quote, what's best for the company, unquote, rather than, quote, what protects my buddy, unquote. Regarding shareholder-nominated directors, proxy access exists, but it's never been used at Goldman. Why? Possibly because investors assumed the board would resist and the effort wouldn't garner votes. If Goldman openly states it would integrate and work with the shareholder nominee who wins votes, that could reduce resistance to using the mechanism. We might even avoid contested elections if, say, the board pre-appoints someone recommended by large shareholders, similar to how some companies proactively appoint an activist's suggested director to avoid a fight. Consider the precedent of ExxonMobil. After engine number one's success, Exxon's board actually became more receptive and added more new independent directors aligned with shareholder concerns. Goldman could learn from that saga. It's better for the board to evolve from within than to be forced from the outside. But being too insular risks the latter. By showing openness to investor input on board composition, Goldman undercuts the narrative that it's a closed fraternity. It could even set a positive trend among banks. Few banks have had shareholder-nominated directors. Goldman could be a leader in collaborative refreshment. Proxyopoly TM recommends this in part because Goldman's credibility took a hit in episodes like 1MDB where clearly oversight failed. Bringing in a director with, say, anti-corruption or regulatory expertise nominated by public pension funds could prevent such failures. If one of the world's savviest banks can't handle a little democracy on its board, that's an indictment. But we suspect Goldman can handle it. It just needs to embrace the idea. Governance policy change recommendation number 5. Strengthen risk oversight and ethical controls. Create a new board risk committee specifically focused on technology, ethics, and risk. Or expand the mandate of the risk committee to explicitly cover emerging tech like artificial intelligence and culture conduct risk. This committee would oversee Goldman's AI development, cybersecurity defenses, and conduct risk, which includes compliance, legal, and reputational risks. It should be chaired by someone with relevant experience. For instance, Admiral Jan Tighe on the board, given her cyber background, would be ideal to lead oversight on tech and information security. Additionally, update the Code of Business Conduct and Ethics, which the board approves, to incorporate guidelines on AI usage, data privacy, and ESG commitments, making the board accountable for these policies. Require management to provide quarterly reports to the board on these topics, including metrics like AI-related incidents, cyber attempts thwarted, near misses on compliance, such as internal audit findings on whether policies are followed. Goldman had that ESG fund issue where policies weren't being followed, and crucially, empower this committee to hire outside experts at its discretion. Example, an independent ethics advisor or technology auditor to periodically review Goldman's practices, the equivalent of an external check to prevent groupthink in risk management. Proxyopoly TM's rationale here is that Goldman's regulatory evasion measure of positive 1.10 shows it often operates at the edge of the rules. One way to curb that is for the board to keep a closer eye on the gray areas where Goldman pushes boundaries historically. By formalizing oversight of technology and ethics, the board acknowledges that areas like AI adoption, algorithmic bias, and complex trading strategies carry not just financial risk, but ethical and systemic risk as well. In 2023, the Federal Reserve was reportedly examining Goldman's consumer unit for compliance and control failures after rapid expansion, indicating some slippage internally. A board committee attuned to such operational risks could have caught issues sooner, like imprudent lending practices or inadequate safeguards. Similarly, with Goldman's heavy investment in AI, they have an in-house Goldman Sachs artificial intelligence assistant for employees, etc., comes the potential for biased outcomes or operational errors. The board should not leave artificial intelligence governance solely to its techies. It is a strategic matter. An example scenario: artificial intelligence models start approving loans in a way that unintentionally redlines certain communities. That is a reputational and legal time bomb. A board committee asking the right questions, such as, how are we testing for bias? What adversarial attacks have we simulated? Could preempt such scandals. Also, given Goldman's propensity to find loopholes, having a formal ethics committee might cause second thought. Quote, will this clever scheme land us in the ethics committee's crosshairs? Maybe let's not do that. Unquote. We note that after 1MDB, Goldman did create new compliance units and emphasized a renewed commitment to integrity. David Solomon often speaks of, quote, reputational excellence, unquote. But culture changes only stick with governance reinforcement. Some peers, like Barclays, instituted a board conduct committee after their misdeeds. Goldman should do likewise to show it learned its lesson. As a bonus, this recommendation gives regulators comfort. Next time Goldman is called up to testify, they can say, quote, our board actively oversees AI and compliance. We have our highest qualified board member leading a robust framework, unquote. That's a better optic than, quote, we'll look into it, unquote. Considering the SEC's Climate and ESG Task Force is actively watching firms for ESG-related misconduct, board oversight here is not just good governance, it's practically expected. In sum, these 5 recommendations of an independent chair, board refreshment with age/term limits, proactive environmental social governance transparency, increased board independence and openness, and enhanced risk ethics oversight together form a governance reform package that addresses the weak points highlighted in the Proxyopoly TM ratings. If Goldman implemented these, we would expect its Proxyopoly TM score to drop significantly closer to a healthier equilibrium where management is accountable and shareholders have a voice. For instance, splitting the CEO and chairperson could reduce executive entrenchment factor and shareholder hostility quotient, in addition to demonstrating proxy accumulation resistance being less needed because the board would be more responsive. Embracing transparency on climate and diversity, equity, inclusion could improve public trust and perhaps marginally reduce regulatory evasion measure, since being transparent often means you're staying in bounds. Strengthening the board's independence might lower the bylaw fortification index, a less informal fortification, and the shareholder hostility quotient to be less hostile if the board itself is receptive. We cite the example of another company that undertook such reforms. Microsoft in the 2010s separated its CEO and chairperson, refreshed its board, and instituted new ethics oversight after some antitrust bruises. The result, Microsoft's governance ratings improved and it became one of the most valuable companies, largely scandal-free in recent years. Goldman could follow that playbook, albeit in a banking context. It is somewhat ironic that Proxyopoly TM recommends Goldman, famed for giving others advice, to take some advice itself. But as the saying almost goes, physician, heal thine governance. Shareholders should press for these changes, and regulators and stakeholders alike would likely applaud them. If Goldman doesn't act voluntarily, expect stronger shareholder proposals or even regulatory nudges. The Federal Reserve could even impose governance changes as part of its supervisory powers if it felt Goldman's governance weaknesses threatened safety and soundness of financial markets. Better to act first. In the next section, Proxyopoly TM will translate some of these recommendations for governance changes into specific votes on directors at the 2026 annual general meeting, effectively saying which directors are part of the solution and which directors are part of the problem.
Attention, Proxyopolists at home. We interrupt this Proxyopoly TM broadcast to bring you the second intermission of this podcast. This is a very pressing and urgent message for the Proxyopolists at home. Are you looking for a way in which to read the Proxyopoly TM score for Goldman Sachs right in front of you, or any of the other proprietary research reports provided by Proxyopoly TM under the framework and protected under the trademark of Proxyopoly? Well, look no further. You can find them on the Patreon, which can be found on the Linktree, which is linktree/NASCARCOSA. If you also want to plug in your own sponsor content or contributed content on this podcast, you can also do so by selecting the Contact Proxyopoly TM option on the Linktree, which is, once again, Linktree/NASCARCOSA. Or if you just want to find some nice, good sounding noise to fill in the background of your meaningless Proxyopolis lives, you can also go to the Linktree, where you may fill that Proxyopoly void you have within. So what will it be, Proxyopolis? Remain an empty void of governance-related quandaries, or will you be a part of the solution? That Linktree is, once again, Linktree/NASCARCOSA.
And we're back. Proxyopoly TM is now pleased to present the 2026 Annual General Meeting voting recommendations for the Board of Directors at Goldman Sachs. For each current board member of Goldman Sachs, Proxyopoly TM provides a voting recommendation for, against, abstain, or withhold, along with a brief rationale that blends factual objectivity with a touch of satirical bite.
These recommendations are grounded in the Proxyopoly TM analysis previously asserted on this podcast, reflecting which directors hinder or help the needed governance reforms. Note, a withhold has the same practical effect as an against in an uncontested director election at Goldman. Since they use majority voting, a withhold vote is essentially a vote against the candidate to withhold support from. Proxyopoly TM uses against for clarity in contested tone unless a scenario specifically calls for abstention. Let's examine each director election in priority order. David Solomon. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote against. David Solomon is Goldman CEO and chairperson, the dual role that epitomizes the firm's entrenchment. While Solomon's presided over strong market performance in some years, he has also overseen strategic missteps, namely the expensive foray into consumer banking that Goldman is now unwinding. His retention of both top titles signals a governance structure where oversight is lacking. Essentially, Solomon chairs the board that's supposed to supervise him. Shareholders signal concern via an independent chair proposal with 16% support in 2023, which Solomon and the board brushed off. Voting against Solomon's re-election is a call for accountability and a separation of powers at the top. It's also a referendum on Goldman's culture. Under Solomon's watch, Goldman quit the Net Zero Alliance, scrapped diversity targets, and paid fines for compliance lapses, including the 1MDB settlement, though rooted in prior leadership. Despite his disc jockey skills and adding a bit of, quote, mixing, unquote, to Goldman's image, shareholders should be unmoved by any star power. In fact, as an against vote is justified to register that the firm's governance remix is overdue. Goldman needs an independent chair and, as CEO, more focused on core business than extracurriculars. Mr. Solomon famously said, "We have to do both. It's not an or, it's an and." Regarding financial oil and green projects, we at Proxyopoly TM apply that same logic to his dual roles as chair and CEO. It shouldn't be CEO and chairperson. It should be CEO or chairperson. Since Goldman or Solomon will not split that role themselves, Proxyopoly TM recommends shareholders split their vote from him. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is Michele Burns. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote for. Ms. Burns brings valuable financial expertise and a track record of board service. A former chief financial officer of multiple large companies and a past CEO of Marsh and McLennan's Retirement Services Unit, she chairs Goldman's Audit Committee and likely the Governance Committee as well, with a steady hand. Importantly, Burns has shown a degree of independence in other roles. For example, on Cisco's board, she was known for probing questions. At Goldman, she appears to be a counterweight to management. With the board needing to adopt stronger governance, Burns' experience in risk and controls is an asset. She's also one of the longest-serving independent directors since 2011, and while that tenure raises some concern, her performance suggests she's not simply a rubber stamp to the board's main agenda. In 2020, when Goldman faced the fallout of 1MDB, it was reported that the audit committee, which Burns leads,
tightened oversight and pushed for clawbacks, a sign she takes fiduciary duty seriously. In addition, a female director with deep credentials, her presence supports diversity in thought on the board. On a satirical note, one could say Burns has the financial acumen to ensure the only things, quote, burning, unquote, at Goldman are old, bad habits. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for Michele Burns as she likely is part of the solution. She can help implement the reforms proposed on this podcast. Indeed, she has the clout to champion splitting the CEO/chairperson roles since she's respected and not part of the management team. Removing her could deprive the board of continuity and oversight just when it is needed most. So keeping Burns on the board and perhaps encouraging her to light a fire under her colleagues for those governance changes is in the best interest of Goldman shareholders. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is Mark Flaherty. Proxyopoly TM, a voting recommendation. Vote for Mr. Flaherty, a seasoned asset management executive, ex-vice chairman of Wellington Management, is one of the board's investment experts representing shareholder perspectives. He joined the board in 2014 after the financial crisis and brought an outsider investor's voice to Goldman. Flaherty sits on the risk and audit committees where he and his understanding of institutional investors' expectations is valuable. He presumably was instrumental in shaping Goldman's moves toward more transparency with investors. Wellington, his old firm, was a large shareholder of many banks, so he knows what investors look for. There are and have been no red flags in his record, no related party transactions or controversies. If anything, as a career buy-side guy, Flaherty likely advocates internally for decisions that align with shareholder interests, like disciplined capital return policies, etc. We at Proxyopoly TM see him as a constructive independent director. During the 2021-2022 period when Goldman's strategy was questioned, having someone like Flaherty on the board was crucial to pressure management to course-correct the consumer banking expansion. By early 2023, Goldman indeed pulled back from retail banking and refocused on core strengths. We at Proxyopoly TM suspect voices like Flaherty's were part of those discussions. Flaherty is exactly the sort of director shareholders want: knowledgeable, independent, and not beholden to Goldman's internal culture. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for his re-election. In a touch of irony, Goldman's board needs more people who manage money for a living, because they inherently think about returns and risk the way shareholders do. Losing Flaherty would reduce that perspective, so a vote for, letting Flaherty keep Flahertying up the board with his pragmatic investor mindset. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is Kimberly Harris. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote for. Ms. Harris is a relatively new addition, having joined in 2018, and brings a legal and utilities industry background. As the former CEO of Puget Sound Energy, she has experience in a heavy regulated sector and expertise in managing large infrastructure projects. She's also an attorney by training. On Goldman's board, she serves on governance and risk committees. Harris adds an important dimension. She's attuned to public accountability given her utility experience. Those companies must answer to public utility commissions, a somewhat analogous scenario to banks with regulators and the public. Her legal acumen likely contributes to Goldman's oversight of compliance and regulatory strategy, exactly what we flagged at Proxyopoly TM as needing improvement. There is no indication that Harris is anything but independent. She had no prior ties to Goldman Sachs before joining the board. She also increases demographic diversity. She is one of the board's African-American directors, which bolsters the board's breadth of perspective on talent and equity issues. Notably, Harris's presence on the board during the period Goldman faced diversity criticisms like the gender lawsuit settlement suggests she might be a voice pushing management to do better internally. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for Harris, expecting that she will support many of the reforms recommended in this podcast. Her background implies she would favor robust governance and ethical standards. If Proxyopoly TM were to project a bit of satirical flair, having run an energy company, Harris knows how to keep the lights on, and at Goldman she can help shine light on some of those dark corners of governance. She hasn't been around long enough to be part of any problem, and evidence points to her being part of the solution, so keeping her on the board is warranted. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is John Hess. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote against Mr. Hess, CEO of Hess Corporation, until its recent acquisition by Chevron, is a long-serving Goldman director on the board since 2013. While Hess brings valuable business experience in the energy sector, his continued presence on Goldman's board raises multiple concerns. First, tenure. At 13 years on the board, he is among the longer-serving independents, potentially compromising freshness of oversight. Second, conflict of interest and ethos. Hess's core industry, oil and gas, is in tension with some of Goldman's stated priorities on climate. Indeed, as Goldman grapples with climate strategy, recall it set a $750 billion sustainable finance goal and net zero by 2050 aspirations. Having an oil executive on the board sends a contradictory message. Hess might be recused on certain decisions, like if Goldman discusses restricting fossil fuel financing. But symbolically and practically, his presence is likely to skew towards slower transition. Third, Hess's own company was recently sold. By 2026, Hess will presumably no longer be a public company CEO, raising the question of how current his insights truly are. In terms of governance, Hess's track record as a director isn't sterling. He sat on the audit committee during the period Goldman missed the alarms on 1MDB. Did he use his CEO clout to challenge management then? Unclear. But the scandal happened on his watch. Additionally, Hess is one of those super networked industry barons. There's a sense in which his board seat, like Mittal's, is partially about prestige club membership. For Goldman to modernize its board, it should retire or replace folks like Hess who have been there for over a decade. Voting against Hess is a vote for board refreshment and fewer conflicts. Satire aside, Hess has literally been drilling oil for 40 years. We don't necessarily need him drilling the same old ideas at Goldman's board meetings for another term. His famous quote is, quote, "The world needs all forms of energy," unquote. Perhaps. But Goldman's board does not need all forms of directors, especially not ones entrenched since the last commodity supercycle. Thank him for his service, turn the page, show him the door, on to the next director. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is Kevin Johnson.
Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote against. Mr. Johnson, former CEO of Starbucks, joined Goldman's board in 2021. At first glance, Johnson brings consumer business acumen and technology background. He was at Microsoft prior to Starbucks. However, there are few reasons to lean against his continued directorship. 1. His tenure at Starbucks, while financially successful, was marked by significant labor unrest. Starbucks faced a major unionization wave and allegations of union-busting tactics under his leadership. This raises several environmental social governance concerns. Goldman employees and stakeholders might question if a director with a reputation for poor labor relations aligns with Goldman's stated values on human capital. 2. Johnson stepped down from Starbucks abruptly in 2022 amidst those controversies, which suggests possible lapses in stakeholder management. 3. In terms of Goldman's needs, Johnson's consumer sector experience is somewhat peripheral. Goldman has largely exited its mass market consumer ventures, such as Marcus and credit cards, by 2026 after costly misadventures. The experiment that perhaps justified adding Johnson to advise on consumer banking strategy is effectively over. If anything, his counsel did not prevent Goldman's consumer banking strategy mistakes, maybe through no fault of his, given he joined late, but it means the original rationale for his appointment has diminished. Finally, the board already has tech-savvy and retail-savvy members such as Mark Flaherty, understanding consumer investors, Ellen Kullman, understanding B2C via DuPont's end markets, etc. Johnson's unique contribution is not evident, whereas his baggage is. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote against Kevin Johnson to allow Goldman to find a director more closely aligned with its future direction. Perhaps someone with fintech or risk experience or a climate finance expert to aid in its transition commitments. Ironically, one might say Kevin Johnson helped brew a strong cup of coffee at Starbucks, but at Goldman the flavor hasn't really suited the palate. It's time to gently send him back to the coffee house, replace him with a director better suited to wake up Goldman on corporate governance issues. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is Ellen Kullman. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote for Miss Kullman, former CEO of DuPont, is a heavyweight director with extensive experience in managing a large global company and dealing with activist investors. She faced Nelson Pelz's Tryon in a high-profile proxy fight while at DuPont. Joining Goldman's board in 2016, she has been a proactive and tough-minded independent director by most accounts. Kullman chairs the Compensation Committee, a critical role given shareholder scrutiny on pay. Under her watch, Goldman's comp has been rationalized to some extent. For example, clawbacks enforced post-1MDB fiasco, and Solomon's pay cut after underperformance. Her experience with activists at DuPont likely makes her sympathetic to sensible shareholder concerns. Indeed, she knows what it's like to have shareholders demand change. That perspective is invaluable on Goldman's board as it navigates public and investor expectations. Additionally, Kullman brings deep understanding of industrial and environmental social governance issues. She pushed sustainability initiatives at DuPont. She can be an internal champion for Goldman's climate and sustainability efforts, helping management strike the right balance.
Maybe she could be the voice saying, quote, "Don't quit alliances like NZBA, or at least keep the substance," unquote. She is also scientifically savvy, now CEO of Carbon as well, at 3D printing tech company, which could aid board oversight of technology and innovation at Goldman. On balance, Kullman appears to be part of the independent core of the board that is unafraid to speak truth to power. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for her continued directorship. While her tenure is now 10 years, her value remains high. Perhaps inject a bit of dry wit here. Ellen Kullman knows how to engineer polymers and corporate turnarounds. Goldman's complex material, from exotic derivatives to human capital, can benefit from her chemistry of pragmatic oversight and willingness to challenge management. Having lost a proxy battle narrowly and stepping down from DuPont, she likely carries lessons on humility and listening to investors that Goldman's board can use. Hence why Proxyopoly TM recommends keeping Kullman on the team. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is Casey McClure. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote for. Miss McClure is a fresh face on the board, added in early 2025. A former chief financial officer of Accenture, she brings cutting-edge expertise in technology services and financial management. Her appointment itself was a positive sign, presumably a response to the need for more tech-savvy oversight as Goldman delves into AI and digital platforms. Given she's so new, the 2026 AGM will likely be her first election by shareholders. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for Miss McClure to firmly confirm her spot on the board. The rationale is straightforward. Her profile fills gaps on the board. Accenture's business gave her exposure to artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and global consulting trends. Extremely relevant as Goldman automates operations and grapples with digital transformation. As Chief Financial Officer, she also adds another strong finance brain to the audit risk committees when she's already assigned there. Proxyopoly TM also values her as part of the succession planning on the board. Some older directors should rotate out as they do. Having capable mid-career directors like McClure ensures continuity. From what we know at Proxyopoly, Ms. McClure is independent, has no conflicts, and her joining was applauded by governance watchdogs. On a lighter note, her initials, KC, might as well stand for Keep Computing, which aligns with Goldman's future. All signals point to her being a diligent overseer who asks the right questions about governance oversight, tech initiatives, and expense discipline. Give her a chance to make an impact by voting for the re-election of Casey McClure. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is Lakshmi Mittal. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote against. Mr. Mittal is an iconic industrialist, head of ArcelorMittal. But on Goldman's board, he's a poster child for the need of refreshment. At 75 years old, and with 15 years of service, he's exceeded what should be Goldman's retirement threshold. While his global business perspective was undoubtedly valuable, it's likely now blunted by time and a potential disconnect with the evolving finance industry. Mittal has also had a demanding role in his own company until recently, which might limit the attention he can devote to Goldman's complex issues. Moreover, Mittal's presence poses optics issues. ArcelorMittal has had its share of controversies, environmental and labor. Not directly relevant to Goldman's operations, but in an era where ESG matters, having a steel magnate tied to heavy carbon emissions on the board might not inspire confidence in Goldman's commitment to sustainability. Indeed, Goldman's exit from NZBA and simultaneous retention of an oil CEO in Hess and a steel CEO in Mittal on the board makes one wonder if the board's composition tilted those decisions. Mittal also falls into the category of extremely wealthy, long-tenured directors who may be less attuned to rank-and-file shareholder perspectives. A satirical observation. Mittal's company once famously bought out competitors to become the world's largest steel maker. On Goldman's board, he's perhaps helped fortify some steel and management's defenses, but that's not what shareholders need now. Proxyopoly TM advocates a vote against Mittal's re-election to the board to signal it's time for him to step down. In doing so, shareholders send a broader message. Multi-decade directorships should give way to the new thinking. There is no doubt Mr. Mittal is accomplished. However, governance is about the right skills at the right time. At this stage, Goldman could replace him with, say, a fintech leader or climate finance expert, aligning the board with future challenges. It's never easy to bid farewell to a titan, but even the strongest steel eventually fatigues. And after 15 years, it's an appropriate moment for Mr. Mittal to graciously retire from Goldman's board. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is Thomas Montag. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote withhold to withhold support from or vote against. Use your discretion. Mr. Montag, former Chief Operating Officer of Bank of America's Investment Banking Division, joined the Goldman board in 2022. As a seasoned trading floor leader, he's no doubt provided insight into global markets and trading risk, which is useful for Goldman. However, Montag comes with baggage. His tenure at B of A Merrill Lynch, while financially useful, was marred by internal culture issues. He was reputed to run his division with an iron fist and favoritism, contributing to a toxic environment according to some reports. That leadership style raises eyebrows in terms of governance and culture at Goldman. Goldman's board should be promoting an inclusive ethical culture, especially post-1MDB and post-Me Too era and post-financial crisis, and a director known for tolerance of toxicity could undermine those efforts. Additionally, Montag's background essentially mirrors what Goldman already has plenty of: trading expertise. The board already has Solomon, for now, Waldron, and others deep with market knowledge. Montag might thus be a bit redundant, or worse. Or worse, he reinforces trading-centric mindset on the board at a time when Goldman might need more diversity of thought, such as customer-centric views, tech-forward views, etc. Furthermore, as a relatively new director, he hasn't yet proven his shareholder value added. In fact, one could argue he was brought on more as an industry insider nod, as being buddies with many on Wall Street, than as an agent of change on the board. His continuing directorship is not critical, given other talents on the board today. And replacing him with, say, someone from the fintech or risk governance realm could be net positive. Therefore, Proxyopoly TM gives a voting recommendation of withhold, support from, or against. The quote withhold unquote nuance is because if one is making fine distinctions, Montag isn't as entrenched as some. He is also fairly new on the board, so some shareholders might give him another year or so to demonstrate his value on the board. However, given his past controversies and rich overlap in skills already on the board, Proxyopoly TM does lean more towards voting against Mr. Montag to vote him out of the board to make room for fresh perspectives. Ironically, Montag's Wall Street nickname was, quote, Tommy, unquote, and some joked it was short for too old school management yeller. Whether that's fair or not, Goldman in 2026 should orient toward a new generation of leadership ethos. And having Montag on the board might be anchoring in the past. Shareholders can politely withhold support and then suggest Goldman find a director with a profile more aligned to its forward-looking needs. Maybe someone expert in artificial intelligence ethics or consumer tech, something beyond pure trading acumen. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is Peter Oppenheimer. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote for Mr. Oppenheimer, former Chief Financial Officer of Apple, Inc., has been on Goldman's board since 2014. His presence is a clear asset. He brings tech industry insight, financial rigor, and experience from one of the world's best-run companies. As Apple's Chief Financial Officer, he oversaw massive growth, supply chain management, and a culture of innovation and secrecy. Those experiences translate well to overseeing a complex firm like Goldman, particularly as Goldman seeks to modernize its platforms and keep a tight rein on costs. Oppenheimer chairs Goldman's Risk Committee, which is crucial for a bank. Under his chairmanship of the committee, Goldman navigated the pandemic-era volatility without major blow-ups, which speaks to effective risk oversight. No news is often good news in risk management, and Goldman Sachs, aside from the known legacy issues, hasn't had a trading catastrophe in recent years under Oppenheimer's risk oversight. Knock on wood. Also, Oppenheimer's background at a consumer-facing, design-focused company like Apple gives him a perspective on customer experience and brand, which can help Goldman as it tries to improve its sometimes tarnished public image. With one minor caveat, Oppenheimer's been on the board for 12 years, approaching a point where Proxyopoly TM would flag refreshment. But out of the long-tenured directors on the board, Oppenheimer is one that Proxyopoly TM views as being still very valuable. He's 60 years old, arguably in the prime of director career, and not shy to apply Apple's high standards to Goldman. Legend has it he's one who asks in the meetings, is this the Goldman Sachs way? And would Apple do this? Pushing for excellence. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for Oppenheimer's re-election. In a bit of wit, having helped Steve Jobs and Tim Cook keep Apple's tight ship, Oppenheimer likely has zero tolerance for sloppy controls or overpaid underperformers. A helpful attitude on Goldman's board indeed. Keeping Oppenheimer on and perhaps encouraging him to mentor some of the newer directors in exacting oversight is necessary for Goldman's board. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is Jan Tighe. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation, vote for Vice Admiral retired Jan Tighe, who joined the board in 2021, is a standout choice in terms of cybersecurity and intelligence expertise. As former head of the U.S. Naval Fleet Cyber Command, she brings unmatched insights on cyber risk, a top threat for banks, and large-scale technology operations. Goldman's digital defenses and data governance surely benefit from her guidance. She also brings leadership skills from the military that emphasize discipline and accountability. cultural elements Goldman can always use more of. Admiral Tighe likely plays a role on the risk committee, especially regarding cyber risk oversight and possibly on governance, given her expertise with structured chain of command systems. Proxyopoly TM strongly recommends a vote for Vice Admiral retired Jan Tighe. Her independent status is unquestioned. She has no prior ties to Goldman and thus provides a truly fresh outside perspective. It's also symbolically and practically valuable to have someone not from the finance club on the board. She can call out any emperor's new clothes situation without predisposition. In Proxyopoly TM terms, she is the type of director who can help lower regulatory evasion measure by insisting on robust compliance and security, as well as proxy accumulation resistance by setting a tone that the board serves stakeholders, not just itself. Perhaps the only ironic note that can be added here is an admiral on Goldman's board suggests the firm is serious about manning its battle stations against threats, be they hackers or be they activists. And that's a good thing for shareholders. Admiral Tighe didn't get those stars on her shoulder by being timid. Proxyopoly TM can trust she'll continue to ask the tough questions and uphold high ethical standards. Again, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Vice Admiral retired Jan Tighe to keep Goldman's ship shape and secure. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is David Viniar. Proxyopoly TM, a voting recommendation. Withhold support from or against Mr. Viniar, Goldman's former longtime chief financial officer from 1999 to 2013, has served as a director since shortly after his retirement from the management team as chief financial officer. This is a contentious vote. Viniar is deeply knowledgeable about Goldman's financials and risks, but he is also deeply entrenched in Goldman's culture and decisions of the past. He was at the financial helm through the 2008 crisis and many controversies, including the period leading up to the 1MDB scandal. On the board, he likely provides insight few can, but that insight comes at the cost of true independence. In effect, having the ex-CFO on the board can sometimes mean marking one's own homework. Will he vigorously critique strategies or accounting decisions that he himself might have set precedents for? Moreover, Viniar has been on the board over 12 years now, adding to the tenure concern. He has served as chair of the risk committee in the past and is probably a key figure in the audit committee too. If Goldman's risk management was exemplary, one could argue to keep him. However, recall that under his chief financial officer tenure, Goldman had some black eyes. For example, Abacus CDO scandal, needing Fed help in 2008, and so on. As a director, while he surely has guided management, he might also have been overly sympathetic to management's excuses. It's like having a homer umpire in baseball. He knows the game, but you wonder if he calls them objectively. Proxyopoly TM leans somewhere between withholding support from and voting directly against Viniar to accelerate board refreshment and increase true independence. Let's also note, shareholders gave only one lukewarm support when Viniar first stood for election. Some governance advocates opposed having a recent insider join the board. Over a decade later, that criticism has not faded. Yet losing Viniar means losing institutional memory. but the board now has other financial experts. Oppenheimer, Burns, McClure, and can call on external advisors if needed. The benefit of moving on is signaling that Goldman is looking forward, not backward. A dash of satire for Viniar. He used to famously use the phrase, quote, "We are seeing things that were 25 standard deviation moves several days in a row" in 2007. A quote often lampooned to show over-reliance on models. In governance terms, maybe it's a 25 sigma event for Goldman to voluntarily let go of an insider ally like Viniar. But it shouldn't be. Voting against Viniar nudges the board to bring in fresh oversight untainted by past decisions. So, with respect for Viniar's service, Proxyopoly TM suggests shareholders withhold support firmly from Viniar and encourage Goldman to find an independent director who can fill his audit/risk-savvy shoes, minus the historical baggage, even if that means directly voting against his re-election. Next director up for re-election to the board on the docket today is John E. Waldron. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: abstain. But it's conditional, so listen up. Mr. Waldron, Goldman's president and COO, was added to the board in February 2025. As David Solomon's top lieutenant and potential successor, his board appointment certainly consolidates executive influence. Normally, we are averse to adding another inside director beyond the CEO, as it heightens executive entrenchment factor. However, given that Waldron is widely seen as the heir apparent to David Solomon, there is a succession planning argument for his presence. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM faces a dilemma. A vote for endorses more management control on the board. A vote against could be interpreted as a lack of confidence in the leading internal CEO candidate, which might destabilize succession planning. Proxyopoly TM therefore recommends a nuanced abstain on Waldron's election. This signals concern about executive bloat on the board without outright rejecting his directorship. If one must choose for or against, Proxyopoly TM would advise leaning against if you prioritize board independence. Lean for if you prioritize continuity in succession planning. Hence the conditional nature of the abstain. Proxyopoly TM's recommendation for the abstention and its stance reflects many governance experts' view. Chief operating officers need not be board members unless CEO succession is imminent. Perhaps by 2026, David Solomon has indicated a timeline to step down, and Waldron would take over, in which case, having him on the board for continuity makes sense. If that scenario is clear, a 4 could be justified. If not, then having two insiders in Solomon and Waldron is overkill. Proxyopoly TM already recommended voting Solomon out as chair. Were that to happen, Waldron's board seat might be the way management retains one insider on the board, the CEO or the president, but not both. Honestly, our ideal is Solomon off the board, Waldron stays as the sole insider, assuming he's groomed for the CEO. Under that restructuring, Proxyopoly TM would support Waldron's directorship. But currently, with Solomon still in, Waldron's presence tilts power too much. Hence, absent changes, Proxyopoly TM maintains its recommendation to vote abstain. In context, Waldron has been effective as Chief Operating Officer by accounts, steering day-to-day ops, and often described as the, quote, good cop, unquote, to Solomon's harder edge. He's respected internally and by clients. Those are positives. We don't oppose him personally. Is strictly professional about governance principles. So, in a dry irony sense, and we'll shift that into the tone here, we're neither coronating Mr. Waldron nor casting him overboard. Proxyopoly TM merely suggests shareholders let their level of confidence in Goldman's succession plan guide their vote. If one thing's clear, an independent board should ultimately determine if Waldron becomes CEO, not a pre-anointed board seat. Thus, a little arm's length via abstention could remind the board to evaluate him critically. If there are strong signs that the board is indeed moving toward making Waldron CEO, shifting Solomon to non-exec or out, then giving him the nod is fine, since we must give a recommendation now. Proxyopoly TM lands on abstain, with a slight lean against in current configuration, but it's conditional. In summary, by voting in the pattern as previously mentioned on this podcast, supporting the capable independents and opposing the entrenched or less effective members, shareholders can incrementally reshape Goldman's board. The goal is a board that will implement the Proxyopoly fighting reforms outlined earlier. These recommendations are not personal knockouts, they're strategic. A vote for the likes of Burns, Harris, Kullman, McClure, Oppenheimer, Tighe keeps strong oversight and diversity of thought. A vote against Hess, Mittal, Johnson, potentially, Viniar, and the caution of Montag and Waldron would send a message to excise the stagnation and over-concentration of insiders. It is a delicate balancing act, but then again, Goldman shareholders are used to balancing risk and reward. We apply the same logic here in voting. Trim the risk of poor governance by pruning the board's dead wood. And increase the reward of a dynamic board by keeping and encouraging the active stewards of good governance. And now we've reached the conclusion of this podcast, Proxyopolis. Almost 3 hours in, we made it. Goldman Sachs stands at a crossroads in governance. The Proxyopoly TM analysis has laid bare the ways in which the firm's power structure, forged over decades of success and scandal, can insulate leadership from accountability and resist shareholder influence. A final Proxyopoly TM score of positive 0.62 places Goldman among the more entrenched of its peers, a status that should give thoughtful shareholders pause. This isn't the Goldman of old partnerships, nor is it yet the model of a modern accountable corporation. It's something in between, a publicly traded colossus with residual private club habits. That gap between perception and reality is where risk germinates. Not just financial risk, but reputational and systemic risk. Proxyopoly TM, in this analysis, which you have listened to, highlighted concerns from the introduction, noting the vampire squid controversies, the artificial intelligence and environmental social governance disclosure issues, through the ratings and into specific board evaluations. The through line is clear. Goldman's governance needs an infusion of independence, transparency, and forward-thinking oversight. Without it, the firm's placement on the Proxyopoly TM index will remain high. And that is not a leaderboard one wants to top. Being a perennial blue property in the board of Proxyopoly TM, if it were a game, which it's not, it's a podcast series, with a lot of other proprietary mechanisms protected under the trademark. The status of being a blue property might be good for management's short-term comfort, but over time it can erode trust with investors, regulators, and the public. Consider the broader index. Companies like Microsoft and BlackRock managed to bring down their Proxyopoly TM scores by adapting governance, separating leadership roles, engaging with shareholders, etc., and they have arguably thrived from it. Goldman's comparables, Amazon, Alphabet, Exxon, those who rank high in the Proxyopoly TM index, are exactly the companies facing intensifying scrutiny and stakeholder pushback. Does Goldman Sachs want to be in the same camp a few years hence? Fending off shareholder revolts or public sanctions? Probably not. Proxyopoly TM reiterates key recommendations. Split the CEO chairperson roles to restore balance at the top. Fortify the board's independence by refreshing membership and capping lengthy tenures. No more perpetual directorships into one's 80s, with all due respect to venerable titans on the board. Embrace transparency on contentious issues, whether it's publishing that lobbying report or recommitting to climate goals, even if it ruffles some political feathers. Strengthen internal oversight via a tech ethics committee, because the next crisis might be a subprime mortgage, or a cyber breach, or an artificial intelligence agent gone rogue. Whoa. These moves are not radical. They are reasonable reforms that align with what many shareholders and stakeholders expect of a leading global bank in 2026. For shareholders, the strategy should be one of constructive assertiveness. Use your votes, Proxyopolists. As Proxyopoly TM has outlined in the annual general meeting recommendations, to signal where change is needed. It's telling that even passive giants like BlackRock have begun to let their index clients vote their shares. The implication is shareholders large and small want a more active say. Goldman's owners should continue this trend. Engage with the board. File proposals if necessary. We wouldn't be surprised if, for instance, an independent chair proposal resurfaces or a request for a third-party racial equity audit comes again. And critically, hold management to its word. If Goldman says, quote, we will continue to report on sustainability progress despite leaving NZBA, unquote, then follow up and ensure they do. And do it rigorously. Proxyopoly TM would also encourage regulators and policymakers to take note of Goldman's Proxyopoly TM score. A positive 0.62 doesn't violate any rule, but it suggests a certain inertia that, if left unchecked, could lead to a compliance slippage or, at the top issues, the Federal Reserve in its supervisory role already informally expects strong governance from systemically important banks. Perhaps they'll be heartened to see shareholders pushing in that direction too. There's a subtle dance here, Proxyopolists. When shareholders push for transparency or climate action and management resists, citing, quote, regulatory constraints, unquote, or, quote, legal risks, unquote. As with DEI targets removal, it might be worth regulators clarifying that good governance and honest disclosure are not just allowed, but encouraged. In other words, public policy and shareholder interests actually align on many of these governance improvements. In closing, Goldman Sachs' placement on the Proxyopoly TM Index is a cautionary tale and an opportunity. The firm can choose to remain a semi-opaque fortress with all the short-term stability that provides, but long-term vulnerability that invites. Or it can gradually open the gates to more shareholder influence and public accountability, trading a bit of insulation for a lot of goodwill. A lower Proxyopoly TM score would not just please investors, it would signify a healthier balance between Goldman's pursuit of profit and its regard for those impacted by its actions, from employees to society at large. As ironic as it may sound, Goldman Sachs could benefit from taking notes from some of its own advice. The bank often counsels clients on strategic pivots and preemptive changes. Now it should heed that wisdom internally. Pivot its governance before a crisis forces it. Change the rules of the game before the dice roll snake eyes. Proxyopoly TM is optimistic that with the right nudges from shareholders and perhaps with a few pointed questions at the next annual general meeting's Q&A session, Goldman's board will recognize that strong governance is not just a constraint on success, but a pillar of it. After all, Goldman's entire franchise rests on trust. Trust of clients, regulators, and investors. Strengthening that trust through better governance is a winning strategy no matter how you slice it. By implementing the reforms outlined in this podcast, Goldman Sachs can reduce its Proxyopoly TM risk, improve its public reputation, and ultimately ensure its longevity as the preeminent and principled global financial institution. In the grand game of Proxyopoly TM, theoretically, the best outcome is not to own all the squares, it's to play fair, prosper sustainably, and avoid bankruptcy at all costs, either the financial or the moral kind. Let us hope Goldman Sachs rolls the dice on good governance and advances down that path. And coming up on 3 hours, that's all the time we have for this Proxyopoly TM episode, Proxyopolis. Thanks for listening. And as always, we conclude with our final disclaimer. The Proxyopoly TM score and accompanying analysis are purely hypothetical for entertainment and educational purposes only. Any resemblance to real-world events is purely coincidental, though with Goldman Sachs' current trajectory, reality may be catching up faster than anticipated. And that's all the time we have, Proxyopolis. If it ain't Proxyopoly, you're Proxyopoly.